I just wanted to welcome you. We were expecting more people, but we will start anyway. Welcome to an LJLA Lamm Jewish Library of Australia event. My name is Lamm and I'm
Can you speak up, please?
And I'm the director of the Lamm Jewish Library. And I wanted to say that it's a very special evening for me because I was asking Danny for a long time to speak about his father because I wanted to understand how Danny and Rolene supported the library and keep working to keep the library alive for day and night, and I'm not joking. They're always available and they're always doing so much for the library. So I'm sure that Erwin Lamm will be so. I'm not going to talk about Erwin, Danny's father. I will leave it to Seamus. But I want to say that Erwin will be very, very proud of Danny. I'm sure of that. And we are honored today to be joined by two distinguished guests. Dr. Seamus Park, who is the co-author of De Nira Lives, the definitive 2 volumes history of the De Nira boys, and the current president of the De Nira Association. And this is one of the volumes. You can have a look after, and you're welcome to come to the library to loan these books and others. And Dr. Danny Lamm, AM, who is the co-founder of the Lamm Jewish Library, and at the moment the chair, the appeal chair of the library. So, and Danny did so many things in his life. When he told me, I was quite astonished. So I'm just going to tell you some of them. So from 1992 to 1996, and from 1998 to 23, and from 1926, did I say 19? Okay, 20. He was the president of Mizrahi organization. From 2002 to 2010, Danny was the president of the Zionist Council of Victoria, which is Zionist Victoria now. Yes, Danny? They changed the name. And from 2010 to 2013, he was the president of the can you help me with the...
Council of Australian Jury.
No, Executive Council of Australian Jury. And then he was the president of the Zionist Federation of Australia from 2014 to 2018. And then the deputy chairman of World Mizrahi still is, and he's doing it since 2010. He was the member of the board of governors of Jewish Agency for Israel since 1997, chairman of the Aliyah Department of Jewish Agency from 2012 to 2020, chairman of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security since 2024. And this is only some of the things that Danny is doing and was doing in his life. And he doesn't speak about himself much. So I think I think we should all clap to Danny, because that is very, very impressive. So there were 2 things that I thought about when I read the chapter about Erwin Lamm in this wonderful book. And one of them was that he was from an anti-Zionist family, belonged to the Agudat Israel stream, that believed that you should only establish the state of Israel when the Messiah comes, or when it is clear that there is a divine intervention. So it is interesting that he became a Zionist leader after. And the other thing that I was very shocked to read is that Erwin's mother, father and brother were murdered in Auschwitz just after Chol HaMoed on October 5th in 1944, sorry. And of course that date resonates with all of us after the 7th of October 2023. So that was, I don't know, quite shocking for me to think about your how your family history is connected to our history.
I'm going to kick off. There's too many microphones. Okay. Normally I just project my voice and it's a much more comfortable experience. I just wanted to say a few things before Seamus takes over. One is that all our events are normally conducted in the library. And I much prefer that because it gives people the opportunity to come through and look at the library. But I've had a sense that its space might be a bit tight. So we're here. And actually I'm comfortable here because I've spoken here so many times in Beth Weitzman. This event isn't taking place because it's something I wanted to do. I was actually a bit surprised that Marav chased me, and as she mentioned, so here I am, and it gave room for thought and reflection, and a lot of reading as well. The earliest person that I recall who came to interview Dad was Ken Inglis, and I was there for that interview in 5 Wooden Grove, where my parents lived from 1953 till Dad passed in 2010 and Mum in 2000. Dad in 2014 and Mum in 2019. Something that'll come up is that in Israel, the Likud government said the Likud home in Australia is my parents' home, because that's where all the visitors came. The next one that I met was Jay Winter, who was just a lovely guy, and then Seamus. So Seamus, want to thank you, and Jay, and the late Ken Inglis for his interest in the whole Dunera project. There are many people here who are Dunera families, the children of, and will probably know a lot more than I will. But in any event, I want to thank you for coming here, and in particular my sister, Gilda, and her husband, Alex, who are sitting in the back row there. So I'm delighted that you're all here, and I'm actually chuffed that there's such a nice and large audience. And that reflected an interest, I think, in the outstanding personality of my late father. So with that little intro, I'm going to hand over to Seamus.
Thank you very much, Danny. I just have a couple of words of introduction as well. We'll then, I'll ask Danny a series of questions, ask him to tell us about his father and indeed about his life. And at the end, we have a few slides that I'll flick through and ask Danny if he'd like to offer reflections on those slides. Just a couple of small matters. It's lovely to see so many friendly faces here, but I'd like to make particular mention of Edith Unga, who's up the back there, the wonderful Edith, who was married to Dunera. I've had the pleasure in recent time, some wonderful conversations with Edith, and it's so nice to see her here tonight. I think Edith is 96 years young and fighting fit. So. In recent times, and Marav's very kindly allowed me to bring it along tonight, we've actually invested the Dunera and Queen Mary Association in some merchandise. So it's for sale up the back. If that seems shamelessly commercial, please bear with me. the money from those sales helped to tell more about Dunera history and about Queen Mary history, and to investigate, those very important episodes in Australian history. So that's where the money is directed to. Tonight we can only take cash, and I don't have any change, so if you give me a 50, I'll be walking out the door. So, last thing before I start with the questions, and Danny, very kind introduction. I thought I'd start by relating an anecdote which Ken Inglis told me often. Ken had the privilege of working with Ken for many years, a great Australian historian, and he loved this story. And it went something like this. He went to interview Irwin and had a very nice day, and in the course of that conversation, I wasn't there that day, but in the course of the conversation, Irwin discovered that Ken's wife, Amira Inglis, a most distinguished writer in her own right, was Jewish. She came to Australia, her parents were Polish Jews. She was born in 1926 and came to Australia in 1929. And Irwin was asking Ken about Amira and her attachment to Judaism and so on, and Ken said, she's very proud of her heritage, but Amira was a well-known member of the Australian Communist Party. She wasn't religious, and so Judaism was never a big part of her life. And Irwin said, was she a believer? And Ken said, no. And Irwin said, well, she is wrong. And Ken loved that story for what it said about Irwin's principles and commitment to a particular way of life and a way of living. And it didn't matter whether Ken or Amira shared that perspective. Ken loved the sure commitment of Irwin's answer, and to a fact that he lived his life according to that commitment. And Ken was very fond of that, telling that anecdote about Irwin. Okay, so thank you very much, Danny. Thank you for your time. As you mentioned, I know you've been a slightly reluctant participant, but we're very happy to have you here. Your father, Erwin Lamm, was born in Vienna on 7th of January 1921. Can you tell us about his family and his early life, please?
So Dad was brought up in a traditional Orthodox home in a very strong community in the centre of the 2nd district of Vienna, the Zweitenbezirk. It was right next to the CBD, so to speak, and it was an ultra-Orthodox framework. 2 million Jews lived in Vienna around that time. 10% of them were Jewish, and the Orthodox section of that was very, very strong. The synagogue that he and his family were attached to was called Schiffschule, Schul being synagogue, and Schiff because it was in a street called Schiffgasse in Schiff Street, and if I think of an example, maybe something like Adas here, but not Hasidic, and certainly not sympathetic to Zionism at all. And it played a very big role. I'm presently writing up something about the minhagim of our shul at Mizrahi, and much of it is based from what I learned from my father of the hallowed traditions of that synagogue and the community there. So he was in this framework. These are like inner city streets, but people lived there as well. The central street of that area was called Taborstrasse. It's like for us, it's Balaclava and Carlisle Street. In other cities, in many cities, you know, there are major streets that people know, and everything that a Jewish person could want was in that area. And the Viennese were polite people and methodical and structured and until a certain time civilised. and they felt extremely comfortable there, very, very comfortable. As my father was growing up as a teenager, he didn't go to a Jewish day school because the Jewish day school was run, his father said, by the Zionists. And that was the worst possible thing to be associated with. And there are some bedfellows here that they could connect with, not Jewish ones. And so he went to the equivalent of a Melbourne High or whatever, existed. And where did you go, Mervyn? Well, there you go, I picked it out for you. And but his Jewish education was one that was acquired in the home, in the synagogue, in the cheder, in the after-school program that took place every single day, and mechanchim, educators, teachers, rebbes that came into the house and taught there. So he had a very strong education. He happened to be really very, very clever, very, very brilliant. And he had this ability to recall everything he ever learnt, which was always tragic for the rabbis who repeated their speeches, because he'd heard them all and he could repeat them all and knew that all. And they were very just comfortable in that environment. And at some stage, Seamus, he was sent to a yeshiva, which was in Hungary. It was Slovakia, Hungary changed borders. It was called Galanta. There were two famous yeshivot there. One was called Nitro, the other one was called Galanta. He went to Galanta. And I can just tell you from my own experience, where things go in one ear and out the other, there are people who learn in yeshivot for years and don't retain stuff. And what he could learn in a year and a half in Galanta was retained forever, and then he'd continue learning. But the commitment was to an ethical way of life, a religious way of life, and felt extremely comfortable in the Viennese background. His parents and the family had a background where they moved, because his father was actually born in Slovakia, and then at some stage moved to Vienna and had a business there. And the business guys, there are seats up the front. They don't cost anything more, David and Pepe. You're welcome. And at some stage they moved to Vienna, and they were in the silk industry, and they provided, schmatters. And it was a successful business. And they had a branch in Bratislava. Bratislava was just 45 minutes by train from Vienna, but it was in Slovakia. So they were moving backwards and forwards. But the family background, interestingly enough, they were farmers generations before. They had livestock and stuff like that when they were in Bratislava.
There was a very, it's quite a common path, wasn't it, from Eastern Europe, the Czech and Slovak lands to Vienna, and then many families, of course, caught up in the Holocaust. Erwin spoke chillingly of the Nazis coming to Vienna. The infamous photos that I'm sure everyone here has seen of Jews being forced to clean the streets, and figures standing around them mocking those people. And Erwin remembered that. Can you tell us about that, please, Danny?
Just to add a little bit before, Yossi, what was the date of the Anschluss? March of 1938. And my father lived in an apartment block which was at number 1 Taberstrasse. Number 1 Taberstrasse was there was a ring road. And then you crossed over and you were in the city. And it was a major building. And these buildings had superintendents, or you would say maybe a janitor, but that guy ran the building. And incredibly polite, everything was terrific. The next day after the Anschluss, that guy was in his brown shirt uniform. He was an undercover Nazi the whole time. And from that date, sort of everything started to change. And thanks to the good work of all these guys with writing stuff up, look, many people who had parents and family with Holocaust experience know that they learnt nothing from their parents because the parents kept it under the table. We didn't know about it. Some of us were at Mount Scopus, and David, and nobody knew anything about anybody else because they themselves didn't know anything. And in the early days, certainly my father didn't tell us any of the stories, as will unfold later, of what an unpleasant experience the whole Dunera thing was. So none of that was discussed, and as a consequence, some of us were brought up totally oblivious to the fact that anybody had ever had any trouble in their lives. You know, we just got brought up in Melbourne and go to school and shul and go to youth movements, in my case B'nai Akiva or Beitar, whatever, and feel and have a totally wholesome, healthy life. And it's remarkable because our parents had a different experience, but somehow in some homes it was a lovely upbringing. Anyway, one day my father gets sent by his father to deliver some fabric from one point to another. By the way, my parents were in Schmadus here, and in the holidays, we came to the factory, and my sister and I were in the factory, and then we got jobs. And I used to do delivery of product around Melbourne. I loved it, actually. I always thought I'd be in Schmadus for the rest of my life. I don't know, I got derailed. But he's walking along, and he's identified by Nazi and whacked and pushed on the ground, and you know, I don't know what epithets he received, but you can well imagine, and start cleaning the road and the street and the blocks and all the rest of it, you know. So different to Australia. Before your time, there was a famous Collingwood footballer called Lou Richards.
I know Lou Richards.
Lou Richards. And Lou Richards later became a commentator, and a very popular one. And he once said that if such and such team beats maybe Collingwood, whatever, he will brush the corner of Flinders Street and Swanson Street with a toothbrush. He lost, and he did. But you know, that was Australia. There, it meant something serious, very, very different. That message then actually came home. And I made that reference before to the antipathy of that background where my father came from to anything Zionist. His father said to him, as he was growing up, there are two people who are coming to visit in the 30s to Vienna that he's not allowed to go and listen to. And one was the great Zionist leader, Zev Jabotinsky, and you can't go and listen to him because he's a Zionist, and this for some people will be of interest. The other one was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It was called the Friedricher Rebbe. You were not allowed to go and listen to him. Sie sind nicht unsere Menschen. They're not our people. You know, very, very biased thinking, and that's the life they live. And the interesting thing, Seamus, is that my father's best friend turned out to be the late Rabbi Groner, the head of the Chabad movement here. So that was the one thing. And my father became the head of the Likud party here, head of the right-wing Zionist party. You know, the total opposite. But I think that had his parents survived, they would have, like the rest of Jewry, suddenly understood that the future is looking after ourselves, and that comes with Zionism. Anyway, as a consequence of that experience, the parents suddenly woke up, and they had this business in Bratislava, and they decamped to Bratislava. And my father says that if they had seen what happened on Kristallnacht, which was November 9-10 of 1938, there's an expression, you know, seeing is believing. In Ivrit, it's endome shmia kriya, that if you see it, it's greater impact. They never saw it. They heard about it. They never saw it. Didn't understand the gravity of the situation. In any event, things had gone quite bad in many respects. The business got taken over. My grandfather had to do a deal with the Nazi person who was placed in there, but he knew the business, so they kept him because it was a very good operation.
Just to go back for a second, you mentioned that your parents protected you. That anecdote about Erwin being forced to the street, at what age did you learn that?
I don't know, Gil, how late was it? It was years and years later. I mean, not as kids.
Yeah.
Not as kids. I learned certain things from other people in school that I never learned from my parents. Nothing was said, And so anyway, on Shivasa Tammuz in 1938, which is about now, in the Gregorian calendar, my father was sent to go to live in Bratislava, even before his parents, because of Kristallnacht was in November. So this is a few months before. The world is a small world. So they knew the Stern family, the famous Max Stern you've heard of. At that family, he was the same age as my dad. They lived in Bratislava, and Judy Siegel, who's sitting here, her auntie Lily, met my father coming on the train in Bratislava to escort him, to take him. Now, it was already a dangerous exercise. There was the possibility he could have been picked up by Nazis already on the train. But that didn't happen, and he got through and he remained there, living in Bratislava. They later came, and then they weren't there for Kristallnacht, so they didn't see the terrible destruction that was wrought on businesses and synagogues and schools and Jewish institutions and so on. And it's very interesting because of those 200,000 Jews, I think some 63,000 maybe survived or something like that. They didn't quite get it. And it's very interesting. My dad, who was a prolific and comfortable speaker, he retained a bit of an accent. We were used to it, But he said wherever he went in the world, people asked him, "Where did you come from?" The only place he felt comfortable was in Vienna. Post-war, he went there many times for business and also invited as a guest by the government. His dialect was one that was comfortable in that framework, and nowhere else. And yet he, notwithstanding everything that happened, he could go back to Vienna, and he met presidents and leaders, and it was fine. He could just deal with it. And somehow that never entered into our lives, in our home. We had a really normal, healthy home, which made me turn out to be maybe the way I am, a little bit enthusiastic or whatever the case may be.
That's one of the things over the years that I've been very struck by as someone who is not Jewish, and before I came to this work had very little knowledge of Jewish culture and religion, is the extent to which Jewish parents after the war in Melbourne shielded their children. This sort of act of selfless love and generosity. It's quite extraordinary.
The people, of course, what my father went through is a speck compared to what many of the Holocaust survivor families went through. At chalk and cheese. And he carried no animosity or enmity or whatever. I only ever saw him get really angry once. We were driving in Africa, and a car pulled up on the other bow to getting petrol, and my father identified that was a contemporarily aged German, and actually got into a very big argument. That was the only time I ever saw him respond to that situation. He, for the rest of it, his focus then became on Jewish life and Zionist life and Israel and productivity. And it was only later in life that we learnt that he suffered terribly from what happened to his parents and to his younger brother. And he carried that with him. And one day he admitted that affected him every night. He didn't sleep properly every night because he had survived because the parents, he was enabled to get out, and they didn't. So the getting out's a very interesting story. There was a very famous rabbi in the United Kingdom called Rabbi Solomon Schonfeld, and he took it upon himself to try and convince the government, the United Kingdom, to allow a number of people to come in. He got over thousands, and they were, in the main, they were all Orthodox. They were what's called Klei Kodesh, people who had rabbinical or synagogal or communal leadership type positions. They might have been shochtim. Tal, is that how your dad got out? No. And rabbis and others, and he was in that group, and that's how he got to the United Kingdom.
And Kristallnacht was the prompt for him to leave.
The Kristallnacht was the prompt for the family to sort of wake up. This is, even though they didn't see it, and not enough for his parents to choose to leave, and not enough for his uncle and his brother Herbert and Eric. They didn't leave. They all stayed. All these families stayed. But anyway, he got out, and in December of 1938. I mean, there was a point later where nobody could get out, and he flew out. He was not on the kinder transport. It wasn't a train thing. He flew out and arrived in the UK, and in your books, it describes how lonely he felt. He never actually told us that. But he had an older auntie who had moved there and lived at N16. Stamford Hill was the Orthodox section. And he knew he had an auntie there, so he wasn't a big challenge, and came there. It's just interesting. It's a slight anecdote. It's a digression. His mother had siblings. The name was Figdor. Figdor. So the Ronnie Figdor's sort of a distant family. Yep. Anyway, earlier on, one of the women, these Figdor women, caught the eye of one of the Kaiser Franz Josef's family. Catching the eye of one of those people means you could suddenly become part of that family, which wouldn't fit into the Orthodox lifestyle. They spirited her out, and she came to the UK. She was in London, so that's how that happened.
There's something you've mentioned. So Owen's parents' names were Emmanuel and Gisela, and his brother Felix, born in 1929, so about 8 years younger than Owen. They were all murdered in Auschwitz in 1944. When did Owen learn about that, discover that tragedy?
Much later. And he got a letter saying that I think came from Herbert, from his older brother, saying we think they're safe, that they survived. And it was misinformation that Herbert had got. And, when this Auschwitz tragedy happened, Jews from all over Europe and North Africa were sent there. And one of the people who was in that camp, his name was Abramovich, he later became a benefactor of Mizrahi, said he saw my grandparents being taken the night before they died. He saw that actually happen. So now we had direct corroboration. He told my dad. They only discovered afterwards, but during the rest of the time, there was nothing. There was just absence of anything. And my grandparents on the paternal side, my dad's parents, were living underground, mainly in and around Bratislava. And there were a lot of people that helped them, and friends and so on, but they had to be shrewd and clever. And some of the people, Herbert, my father's older brother by 7 years, just to show you how confusing the situation was. He was a strong physical man, and he got called up by the SS to come and serve. He had a good German name, Herbert Lamm. Lamm means lamb, and Herbert is a German name. My father's name was Erwin. You know, today many Jewish people use their Hebrew names, you know, but at that stage everybody had two names. They had a Hebrew name, a Jewish name, and a local name. And so Herbert got called up, and the moment he got called up, he left that location, because eventually they come and say, well, you're 21, you're strong, you're fit, why aren't you serving? He had a wife and a child. He was actually 1914, so we're talking 1941. He was 27 or whatever. He already had a kid, George, who now lives in Israel. And they lived underground, and they moved from place to place. Judy's father, Max Stern, was one of those people who was active in that way, and they helped each other, and they moved around and so on. In our library, in the Lamm library, we've got You Write Your Own Story, and one of them is Max's. Two of them are Max's stories. People wrote about their experiences. Herbert got caught at one stage. He fought off the Nazis that tried to trap him. He fought them off and ran away and got away. Erica got caught once, and Erica, my auntie, was a very attractive, gregarious, extrovert lady, and so the Nazis took her to the Slovak police, and she had conversations. She went out the back door. She escaped. So, there was miracle stories like that. My father came to the United Kingdom. He lived in Stanford Hill. He had the auntie there. He had the environment. The environment wasn't vastly different to what he'd come from. And he needed to earn money, although his parents were sending him the money because the business kept going. And they weren't impoverished. They were comfortable. But he worked, and he went into the schmutters business, and he became a cutter. So he had work and lived there, and things went rather well for a period of time, till it didn't.
Which brings us to the Danira. So on the Danira and throughout his life, the rituals of Orthodox Judaism were a source of strength, support and moral guidance for Erwin. And to paraphrase Joe Winter, Erwin lived his faith. Can you expand on that for us, Danny?
That's our family background, thoroughly invested in Judaism. So my father could as I said, my father had a great brain and learnt a lot, and was very engaged in Jewish learning and scholarship. And there were great rabbis there in where he'd come from and where he was and where he would later be. And so he just kept learning the whole time. And so he could lead the prayers, and he could read from the Torah, and he could do all the things that were necessary and just be part of it. And he was totally, as many of us are, we're just totally involved in our Judaism. Many of us are Orthodox, but others are not, and they're still invested in their Judaism in different ways. So he remained involved in that all the way. And just to give you an illustration, I want to go back a little bit to how stupid he believed the British were. But on the day that he was taken to the ports to go on that Danira ship, there were members of the Jewish community who were going around saying goodbye. It wasn't such a tight security situation, and there was a guy handing out decks of cards, and my father saw it, and it didn't interest him for one iota. And by the way, I've never played a game of cards in my life either, but he also saw that somebody was handing out psalms, Tehillim. He said, if you could rather get me some Tehillim, a book of psalms, P-S-A-L-M-S, I'd rather have that. That was just an indication. That was a commitment to our Jewish heritage and so on. And anyway, the background that many people know is that with the falling of the what's it called, the Maginot Line of in France, which was formerly believed to be impregnable, the Nazis just went round, you know, don't have to go through the front door, and they did the Blitzkrieg and they took everything over, and the British suddenly got terribly scared. How could that happen? It must have happened because there was a fifth column that was there. And I'm repeating to you the things that I learned from my father afterwards, not when we were younger. And they decided then, and they looked around, and there were apparently some 70,000 enemy, what they called enemy aliens, people of German, Austrian, Italian background, all the enemy. And they decided to incarcerate them. It was Churchill who actually did that. Churchill afterwards recanted, but he did it. And my father, being an enemy alien, an alien all the time, had to report to the police once a week, the whole time, from the beginning, which was perfectly comfortable. You know, go in there, and in that period, he goes in there, oh, we've captured another one. They captured him, came in to sign, you know, they captured him. And they got incarcerated and so on. And in your Dunera Lives there, and in other books, it says the people didn't know. He knew he was going to Australia. He knew that ship. So some people knew. And he didn't care again because he had a sister living in Melbourne. So he thought, that's okay, come to Australia. And so he was a man who was just an optimist, constantly. And I'll come into that a little bit later to tell you about some of his political attitudes. So they get incarcerated, they collect them on some race course or something, and eventually they put them on the ship on the Dunera. I don't know if all the people here who, with the Dunera background, know some of the stories, stuff that I heard later. Can we jump to that? Interested in that?
Yes.
Okay. So when the Royal Navy took this carrier ship and decided they're going to put all the people there and send them out. And I've read figures of 2,700 and 3,000, so I'm not sure what the accurate number is.
About, including the fascists, about 2,500.
Right. So they put them on, but they didn't have a crew. And the way I understand it, they went to the prisons and they released crooks and offered them release from the prisons if they would serve as crew on the boats. And that then explains to a large extent, at least my father's understanding, why they turned out to be such rotten eggs. You know, they behaved very badly and treated them very badly, and they stole from them and did everything. It's because they were the schmutters, the zevel, the schmutz of the UK, and they suddenly got uniforms and given guns. There were obviously some crew, but it was a bit of a challenge because the UK was surrounded by U-boats. It was a challenge to send boats out of there. This is not in your book, but this is a story that I've heard, which is something that you referred to there, which is that they're on the boat and they come with their suitcases, and the suitcases are stored somewhere, and all the incarcerated people are below decks, and these crew then started going through the suitcases to pilfer stuff. The guards. I'm misusing the word, Leon. Guards. The criminal guards, and sometimes they just threw the suitcases over. They didn't need them anymore, right? And there's talk there about an officer who told the incarcerated ones, if you give me your valuables, I'll store them for you because these other guys might steal. And of course, he had the biggest taking of all. And my father, later when he met my mum and was introduced to my mum, and he came up with an engagement ring that his mother had sewed into his jacket. Other people had to store things. It was sewn in the lining. Anyway, that's what happened on that boat. And they threw suitcases over. And the suitcases were bobbing on the water. And the story is that a U-boat spotted the boat and fired a torpedo at it. The torpedo did not explode. One version is it actually went under the boat and it didn't blow it up. They fired a second time and it also didn't explode. The captain reported back to base in Germany or wherever he was getting his orders from, reported, and he was told, track the boat and see why our torpedoes didn't work. Eventually they surfaced, they opened the suitcases, found clothing with German labels on it, and determined that it must be German prisoners of war on the boat, and the boat didn't get hit, the Dunera. The Arandora Star that went to Canada, that was sunk with a loss of 800 lives, and some of the people that survived were then put on the Dunera, which was a later departure. So miracle things happened.
There are various, probably more so than any other incident in Dunera history, the submarine and the torpedoing has various versions, and one of my favourites is there was a wonderful artist on the Dunera called Hein Heckroth, who became famous after the war as an Academy Award-winning stage designer, but he's a very significant surrealist artist, and before the war had been painting with Dali and Picasso. And his grandson told me, with a straight face I might add, that the torpedo went through the hull and lodged in a cargo of cheese and didn't explode. That's my favourite.
It's a good story, but they didn't have any cheese. and ultimately, some cheese did come on board when they passed Fremantle. And then they arrived in Sydney, and what looks like half the Australian army is waiting with their guns poised for these dangerous people.
I'm going to...
I just want to say one other thing. My father never complained about what happened on the boat. He told us ultimately the stories of the pilfering, this, that, but he didn't complain that it was a terrible experience. But if you read reports and that people put in, and there's a very nice book, I left it in the car, a Dunera workbook, you've probably seen it, and in there are these first-hand reports, and they describe the terrible conditions on the boat, the gastrointestinal issues that people had, and the shocking food and inadequate air. Half an hour a day they could go on the boat, and and crowded conditions, hammocks here, and then people couldn't move without touching somebody else. And there's a story of one person who got sick and then stayed as long as possible in the sick bay because there was more space and so on. So they did have a terrible time, but he never spoke about it. Gornished. You know what he said? One story was, when they came past Fremantle, he could see in the porthole that they'd come to Australia and not Africa. Because they went past Africa, he saw that too, but just kept going, and they knew that the destination that he believed he was going to was in fact a reality.
So Erwin, I think quite a few questions to get through, so I won't touch on his camp experience, but so move to the next stage. So he was interned at Hay until May 41, which was the common date when the Dunera men were moved away from Hay, and then at Tatura until September 1942. And this meant he was interned at Tatura longer than most. Most of the Dunera men who signed up to join the army were released in early 42. Am I right in thinking that Erwin only joined the Australian Army, the 8th Employment Company, once he could be assured that the Army would provide kosher food and for other specific needs?
I didn't know that till I read that in your book. Gilda, do you know that? Did you know that? No. Yeah, so I didn't know that. I don't know how that happened. His recounting was that the first opportunity to get out he took, but it doesn't appear apparent with the records, because he was 21st of September.
He could have, had he wished, he could have been released 6 months earlier.
Right, and some people were, so I can't explain that. I'm sorry, I failed. But the valuable thing to report about the camp was three things really, if you like. One was that he was appointed a hut representative of a particular hut, and I think it was Hut 7. And so he started to go to meetings and he found his voice. And that remained with him for the rest of his life. So he learnt to speak in that framework, because they had a sort of a democracy, you know, where they all raised issues and discussed things. So that was the one very important thing. The second very important thing for him was they set up yeshivot in those camps. And they had these great rabbis there, and I made the effort to write down the names. There was a Rabbi Ehrentraut, a Rabbi Feuchtwanger, a Rabbi Blumenthal, and a Rabbi Simmels. And Yossi, writing in the Jewish News, has written a lot of material about that in the past. And so they had formal learning, and they were very engaged. I don't think there were enormous numbers. The figures that they talk about are about 200 Orthodox that were in the camp.
I have a little booklet. My father was involved in the kitchen, 197 names are there of people.
So that's approximately the 200 that I say. Yeah. And right. Right. So according to their records, some of the people who took the kosher food weren't necessarily Orthodox, but did decide to connect in that way. And there was a small group that learnt, and he was one of the people that learnt. And he got an extra year of yeshiva. So. And the other thing, he got his matriculation there, because in 1938, after the Anschluss, at the end of year 11, so to speak, he was not allowed to come back to school the next year. Anyway, he left it and so on, but he got his matriculation in that camp, which was, you know, obviously a fantastic thing. When he got out. I'll repeat it. Yossi says that he's got almost 2 complete compendiums of Talmud that came from the camp. When he got out, one of the things that he got out for, he was discharged to be the rabbi. He was not, but to be the rabbi of a fledgling shtibel called Beis Ephraim. a man called Ephraim Pollack had established it. And it was the forerunner of many breakaways from synagogues. It was just another one. They broke away from Melbourne. And so they had this congregation in Brighton Road, and he had papers that came from the United Kingdom to say that he was qualified to be a reverend, and then he came, and he then notionally became the rabbi. He was not. He didn't have smicha. The family tradition, maybe it applies to your family too. The family tradition was to only take a rabbinic title if you were going to practice as a rabbi, or if you were going to be a mechanech in a yeshiva, or that type of thing. So whereas he or his late father or his brother, all of them could have got smicha without a problem. That's not something they chose to do, because he always had the intentions of going into business. So he was in basic frame, and now he had this sister here. This is a great story. I can't gloss over it. He's on the train, having arrived in Sydney on Shabbos, and they're on the train, and an Australian soldier says Shabbat Shalom to him. And this is an example of how quick my father was. He says to him, the guy was obviously a digger in Palestine, and served there. And they had very positive attitudes to the Jews. They didn't have positive attitudes to the Arab, but to the Jews they did. And so he on the spot says, I've got a sister living in Charnwood Crescent in St Kilda. This is the address, and can you tell her I'm here? I mean, that's an example of chutzpah, of amazing bravado, and ability to, spontaneously do that. 4 weeks later, that soldier did it. He knocked on the door in Charnwood Crescent, near St Kilda Synagogue, and said, please don't ask me any details, I can't do that, but I can tell you your brother is arrived and safe here in Australia. That's a big deal, The other thing worth mentioning as well is the reception of the local Jewish organised community was not very nice. I might tell you, just as a digression, the Jewish community of Perth, pre-war, weren't too nice about people coming there either. They were really happy to give them money to keep going. Just, we'll give you money, £500 or whatever, go to Adelaide, go to Melbourne, go to Sydney. They were scared about a disruption to the ecology. Don't mean to offend you, Mervyn, but it's in the Perth Hebrew Congregation Annuals.
Remember, can you hear me here?
Yes.
I remember distinctly because I was born in 1941, but in about 1944, 45, 46, going to the docks with my parents, and they had food parcels, and anybody on the ships that were coming from Europe, particularly post-war, they were giving food parcels to them and money on condition that they went further to Melbourne and Sydney.
So that doesn't.
But I can visualise it to this minute.
So there we have it. Listen, he wasn't placed here. Pass him the microphone. Mervyn, to Yossi.
There's a further touch to that.
Yeah.
There was the group who made their way across the Trans-Siberian Railway, got themselves somehow. They got themselves to the other side. Not sure if it was Kobe or Shanghai, but then they got themselves to Perth, to Brisbane. They turn up in Brisbane, and the Reverend there was pleased to see. I don't know what he thought one Sunday when these guys wandered into his. But anyway, he said, "This is not the place for you. Go to Melbourne." When they came to Melbourne, Francis Barkman and co. made a reception for these people who escaped. But to notice that they didn't eat, they decided they were too frum and gave them tickets to go at that stage. The Pacific War hadn't begun yet, and gave them tickets to go to the States. This was a big issue. People didn't necessarily go and tick.
We didn't fill ourselves always with glory. Anyway, the other thing that I wanted to mention is when they were in Tatura, the Feiglin, the patriarch of the Feiglin family, Moshe Zalman, he came there and he brought them freshly shechted meat. Suddenly they had catch. That was a beautiful experience for them because they previously had, as you've documented, somebody from Jewish welfare. We're happy that you're here, but you're not staying. Very sad. Sorry, lots of digression. We could talk about Collingwood in a moment, but never mind. Okay. The footballs. Sorry.
I get enough Collingwood from my mother, who's in the back. So before I move on to your father meeting your mother and post-war life...
no, that was in 43.
Yep.
43. And the reason I mention that is my auntie, her name was Lily Klein, she made the connection to my mother's father. They arrived in 1939, August 39. She made the connection with the Stock family, and the Lambs and the Stocks came from the same street in Vienna, and my father didn't know my mother because boys didn't know girls, and were introduced, and they got married in 1946.
So just to go back, so two of Erwin's siblings, Herbert and Emmy, survived the war. Can you tell us about, I mean, you mentioned Herbert earlier, but can you tell us more about them and their survival?
Look, Herbert was, they were smart. All of that chevra, they knew how to navigate, and they remained underground for most of it. He eventually got caught the second time, and he went to Theresienstadt, and she managed, and there was a lot of help around from friends, and she had, George was born in 1941, so he's this little baby that she had there underground and so on, and they came out in 40s. He then survived Theresienstadt, and they carried on, and he came in 1947. And you know, unlike the previous story, the people like we're talking about all supported each other, and they were sending them the opportunities to get visas and money and help and all sorts of things. So one after the other, and as soon as the one came, he started bringing the next one, and so there were a lot of families, and there were a lot of families who would come to me and say, your father, your uncle, your grandfather, you know, brought us out and saved us. And I might just digress just for another little story. There was a man called Korbel, not the Jewish Korbels. There was a Korbel, a guy who in Bratislava managed to save a lot of people. And eventually, he also got caught out, but he survived. And when he came to Australia, my grandfather, so on the maternal side, provided him with a house in Mirabinish, and until they were on their feet. A non-Jewish person who currently is going through the righteous Gentile thing for Yad Vashem. So people did support each other. Anyway, that was the story of them. My auntie from 1939, she and her, I just want to tell you how bigoted some of the people were, our people. So in 1939, my auntie and her husband go to her parents, my grandparents, and say, we think we should leave, we want to go to Australia, and they said to them, go. His parents, who were also in that ultra-Orthodox community, said, how could you possibly agree to send our children to Australia, which is Ek Welt? It's the end of the world. They'll get lost. What about their Jewish life, you know? And never spoke to my grandparents again. You know, that was... Anyway, they were very comfortable. They looked after my dad when he eventually got discharged in 44. And and then he started working and, you know, all this sort of stuff.
So you mentioned your mother's family, the Stock family. Where did your father and mother meet?
They were introduced on a Sunday afternoon at probably either the Stocks place or the Kleins. I think the Kleins went out to the Stocks, and they were introduced, and it was love at first sight. And are we running these videos on the back? There's a picture of my mum. She was gorgeous, and he fell in love, and she fell in love with him, and they got married 3 years later, and he when he joined the employment services, he had a few good. There's my mum. That's my mum. She was 15 then, and that's her father, and her mother had died when she was just a kid, Stock, and so this was someone he married the second time round. Anyway, they were introduced that way, and everything went well. In the employment company, there were a few funny experiences. First of all, they had a Maori captain called Tip Broughton, and the guy had great respect for people who were faith believers, and he facilitated that my father had Shabbos off every Shabbos, and the camp was in Royal Park, something in that direction, and my father would then go for Shabbos to North Carlton or wherever the Jewish people or community was staying, and as long as he came back Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night, that Tip Broughton was completely comfortable with it. And here I want to, you know, along the way in life you get help. Hakarata tov, we say in Hebrew, you should appreciate. There was a new family, the News. Victor New was ahead of us in school one year. And, but not that family, they had 3 sons. One was the late Maya New, the late Louis New, and Mendel, who's still with us. And when my father came there for Shabbos, one of the new boys was tipped out of the bed because the soldier had to sleep. That's how he was looked after, you know. The other funny story was that at one stage, my father was going to get transferred to Albury Wodonga. Now, what happened in Albury Wodonga, as many of you Aussies will know, we had 2 different train gauges in Victoria and New South Wales. So everything of the army supplies and anyone who moved had to get off the train, transfer to another train, and everything had to be transferred because the trains couldn't go all the way through. My father was in charge of, was like a warrant officer or something, you know, and one day he gets a notice to say he's being transferred to Albury Wodonga. And he goes to Tip Broughton, and he obviously didn't want to go because, you know, Melbourne was pretty good. The Tip Broughton said, "God, I taught one idiot how to do the job and I'm not having to train another one." So he managed to prevent that happening, and he remained in Melbourne. Look, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was really what the title was, how he became a Zionist leader and so on. So can I get into that a little bit? So he's there. He then learns about what happened to his parents. He saw everything that happened subsequently. He's going out with my mum. My mum was a member of the Beitar youth movement. She was one of the first young women in 1939 to be part of that. My grandfather, the maternal grandfather, her father, was a committed Zionist already then. He'd been involved in helping the second Aliyah in Europe, and very ideologically involved with Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was the one who said, liquidate the diaspora will liquidate you. He gave the messages very early that people had to learn how to fight and so on. By the way, when I was at school, all I wanted to do was play football and basketball, and all my father said the only thing you need to do is how to fight. That's what he learned from his whole experience. So my father moved into this family who were avowedly Zionist, and he became a Zionist, and he then became part of this movement of supporting of Israel, and this is pre-48. Now, the major parties that were fighting in Israel, there was the Haganah, there was the Irgun, and there was the breakaway, the Lehi. 30 years after the war, when the classified papers of the government were released, we found out that Mr. Zygmunt Stock and Mr. Erwin Lamm were being monitored for 30 years because they believed they were gun running to the Irgun. And it wasn't the case, but they believed that. But what they were doing is they were raising funds. That was the case. So he became, and my grandfather became involved in Zionist leadership very early in the piece. He brought my dad in, and my dad, who was now a very confident speaker and so on, became involved in all the various movements. And so he was involved in the Jewish Community Council of Victoria, which was called then the Board of Deputies, at the time when everybody can recognise Menachem Begin up there, Mum and Dad, and Erica. I'm going to move out the way. You don't want to miss these photos. So one of the discussions at the Board of Deputies was about establishing a Jewish day school. My father was one of those people that was involved. Menachem Begin came here in 1963. He was a guest of the Zionist Council of Victoria, State Zionist Council of Victoria. The then president between 60 and 64 was the late Arnold Bloch, a great Jewish leader, and my father was his vice president. So Begin came, and this is Yitzhak Shamir, who was Prime Minister from 82 to 92, from 82 to 92. And that's Jabotinsky in the back. So he was involved in the Zionist Council, and where he was, that's Bibi, that's John Howard as a good friend, and Bibi and Dad was wearing the Likud hat. It's 1977, and he's wearing the victorious hat of the Likud party. It's the first time that the right-wing party was elected in 1977. And he comes to tell John Howard about, who is, we know. And that's that. On the right is Shimshon Kamal, Robert Zablud, that's Don Chip. And that, I think, is Brian Smith, who played on the wing for Melbourne. And Brian Dixon, and he was a minister in the Victorian government. And who the other one is, I think the other one's Ian McPhee. Ian McPhee? I think that's Ian McPhee. There's Don Chip. What a great looking bloke he was. There's another photograph I didn't show you where he's gazing very intently at my mum. But I decided to leave that photograph out. Let's go to the next one. That's the late Arnold Bloch. And that's my father in a typical role, speaking and so on. So he was involved in the Zionist Federation, and he had a very strong ideological base, and he stuck to his guns under all circumstances. One of the portfolios that he held for a long time was the portfolio for tourism, and he was promoting people to go to Israel and hosting events with travel agents and pushing Israel as much as he possibly could. He was the head of the Likud movement in Australia for many years, and look, people change. Ehud Olmert has changed, but when Ehud was younger, he was coming to my parents' house, and obviously the connection with all the others. Look, I think we've gone on for quite a long time. Is there anything else that you feel?
I think just ask one maybe final question to finish on, which you've already touched on, but is it fair to say that your parents shaped your own politics and pursuits?
Oh, absolutely. I was brought up in a home where politics was discussed at every meal. And my father had this confidence to engage with anybody. So he engaged with all prime ministers, you know, first names of Malcolm Fraser. I mean, I don't know what use he was, Malcolm Fraser, but, you know, and so on. So I'll give you an example of my father's engagement. In 1972, Gough Whitlam won the election. And there were there were only two people running that government, him and Lance Barnard. For 100 days, there were no ministerial appointments. So my father wanted to have an influence. He wasn't going to achieve anything with Gough Whitlam, so he invited Lance Barnard to come for dinner. So Lance Barnard is in Wootton Grove for dinner, and my father is very eloquently presenting the case for Israel and so on. That was the extent of it. So he would speak to people on the Labor side, the Liberal side. Well, I mean, obviously we were strong Liberals. He was in the Liberal Council and all the rest of it. So we had that, and of course we had the Jewish stuff. So Menachem Begin was in our house, and he brought me a book, the book of his famous book, The Revolt. And the book describes his background, the development of Beitar, the development of the Irgun, the underground, the handing over of the Irgun to become part of the IDF, the story of the Altaleh, all this sort of stuff. And he brings me the book, and it says, Le Menachem mi Menachem. To Menachem from Menachem, because my Hebrew name is Menachem. In 1968, when I spent a bit of time in yeshiva, I'm walking down Dizengoff, and Menachem Begin is sitting in Cafe Roval with his secretary Yechiel Kadishai, and he sees me, he recognises me, he waves me in, you'll like this, and he invites me to have dinner with them. So we had these political connections and across Israeli politics and so on. So just in finishing off, if you want, in we've got the World Zionist Congress is coming up. And from July 1 to July 27, people in the community will be able to vote. You have to go online, put in your name and your details, etc., not your bank account, and pay $5. That's it, and you can exercise your vote. And there'll be a range of parties and so on. One of them will be the Mizrahi Party. I'll be the head of that. Please vote for me. Okay, fine. In 1972, they had these elections because the Congress has been going since 1897. Initially, it was every year, then 2 years, then 4, and so on. In 1972, very strong election, and my grandfather was elected. Sigmund Stott, my father, Erwin Lamm, Mark Liebler, Ron Finkel, a young upstart, as a student, post-student, we were already graduated, but, it was a bit unusual, but people ran campaigns. We're in Binyanei Ha'umah, the main building that all these communal stuff happens, which, by the way, is owned by the WZO. Together with the Jewish Agency. And Ron Finkel is speaking. And on behalf of WUJS, the World Union of Jewish Students. And Ron's a lefty. He's my friend, but he's a lefty. Hasn't changed. And so he's up there speaking, and I see a Likud guy, a Frenchie. And the Frenchies are a little bit, they're a bit harif, they're a bit sharp. And I see he's going to come, and I can see he's going to hit him. I'm sitting in the front row because I'm there too. I'm not a delegate, but I was the head of the student movement, so I was there too. I'm sitting in the front row with my father and grandfather. I jump on the stage, and I had karate background, and I blocked the punch. On the front pages of the Jerusalem Post and everything, there's just an arm. When we were in school with my friend Abi over here, in year 8, he set up an organisation called Ha'egrof, the fist. So there is my fist blocking this guy Jacques' punch at Ron, and Ron just keeps talking. So the answer is, it formed everything. So that's how I ended up coming the head of the Zionist Council, head of the Federation, head of the ECAJ, and part of Likud and part of Mizrahi and so on. And I'd like to say it funds my existence, but it doesn't. It's not like that. All that happens is I pay. But it's been wonderful, and it's been great to be involved with the community. I just want to toss in one other final thing. They were in Schmudders, the family, and in the clothing business. The most financially rewarding years were during the war. They made pots, and then it kept going, and my father and my mother and my auntie and my uncle and my grandfather, everybody was in the business. And Gilda and I were there during the holidays, and my father, the rabbi, is a fashion judge at the Melbourne Cup. Because Hit Parader was a big label, and in 1967, when Red Handed won the Melbourne Cup, and it's the only time I ever put a bet down. I won $2.50, and I went with Dad, and it was, of course, a fantastic experience. And as an Orthodox Jew going to the Melbourne Cup, you're wearing your suit, because everybody wore suits, and you're wearing a hat. Bob's your uncle. It was a piece of cake. So anyway, that gives you a sense. Dad was clever. He was smart. He was urbane. And if I can just finish off with something. This is written by Mark Liebler, who I normally don't quote. But Dad won an award called, I'm grateful to my sister because Gilda and Alex had all this material, so they dropped it over. He's been invited to give the speech of honour to Dad. Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to present this award to someone who is very deserving of receiving it. He's a person who has always, as long as I can remember, and no doubt well beyond that, been a prominent and respected member of the Zionist movement, and I refer to Erwin Lamm. Erwin Lamm's principal contributions to the Zionist movement have been in the areas that we well know, of tourism and public relations. But he is very much an all-rounder, and he has input in all areas, including Zionist education, in which the Zionist movement has been involved over a period of, in his case, many decades. He's one of the most articulate spokesmen for the Zionist movement, and it doesn't matter where he is, whether it is in this forum here or whether it's in the Board of Deputies. One of the wonderful things about Erwin Lamm is his gifted sense of humour, which I might say has been used with devastating impact on the opponents of Zionism. He has never shirked controversies. He'll always put a point of view, no matter how unpopular that point of view, and he'll fight for it right till the end. Often we talk about the lack of political parties and lack of ideology in the Zionist movement today. Well, of course, Erwin Lamm is living proof of the fact that that isn't the case. His own personality, his own active Zionism, his own involvement as one of the leaders and leading members of the Australian Zionist Revisionist Organisation here in this country testifies, I think, to the continuing viability and validity of ideology and to the contribution that ideology is able to make to the Zionist movement. It provides, shall I say, our life and our framework. Erwin himself very much exemplifies the concept of hadar. Hadar is civility, is distinguished, is distinction, is correct, courteous, civil behaviour. It's a great value of the Beitar movement. Describing the dignity and self-respect precept of honour, he has made a unique, a valuable and a meaningful contribution to Zionist life in this country, and therefore it really is with much pleasure that I present him with this award, the Chaim Weizmann Award, for devoted and outstanding services rendered to the cause of Zion through the Zionist movement in Victoria. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really grateful that you came.